It is my great pleasure to welcome our speaker for today, Eerika Finell. Eerika is a professor of social psychology at the University of Eastern Finland. She completed her PhD at the University of Helsinki, and her research is focused on intragroup processes and how they relate to well-being, people's experiences and attitude. It is my great pleasure to welcome you here today. So the mic and the floor are yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this nice introduction, and so much I want to thank everybody who's involved about inviting me here to talk. This is really a big honor to me and pleasure. So today I'm talking to you about perceived environment threats, group processes, and well-being. There's one thing I hope that you remember from this talk, and this is that physical environment matters. When we study group processes, we should take into account the physical environment where the group is. That is where they work, that's where they study, where they live their everyday life. And why is so? Because group processes shapes, so physical environment shapes group processes, and group processes shapes how we perceive the physical environment, and this also shapes the group processes. So the group processes and physical environment are interconnected. I have divided this talk in 3 parts. In the first part, I will speak a little bit about disasters. In a second part, I will introduce the concept of indoor problems, that is the context I've been studying for a while. And the third part, there I present you some research on indoor problems. So what is a disaster? First, I want to emphasize that the research field on disaster is really large. There are lots of research, and it's highly multidisciplinary. It includes different kind of theoretical approaches, different frameworks, different perspectives, and it's really clear that there are not one definition of disaster. But it seems that there's one thing where there is a clear consensus, and that is that the disaster is a social phenomenon. Why is it so? In order to understand, we need to start from the agents of a disaster. An agent of disaster can be a stormy sea. It can be a river with surface rises, so it floats over after continuous rain. It can be a tornado, or it can be a radiation that escaped from the nuclear plant. But these are not disasters. They're just wind, they're just water, they're just radiation, or like now it's only heat. A disaster appears when an agent is in contact with the social system. Like here in this painter of Turner, this boat or ship is in the stormy sea, full of, we suppose, sailors or fishermen. And this is the moment when there's a risk of disaster, and the disaster is a disruption in a social system. Disaster is very much then a socio-psychological phenomenon, that is a change or dysfunction or collapse of social processes, a social system. What's important to bear in mind that actually damage, although this is also often associated with a disaster, is not the defining feature of a disaster. Also, a threat of an agent of disaster can produce a disruption in social system and a disaster. When we think about disasters, usually we think something very large, something which is devastating, with a lot of destruction. People might have lost their life. It touches lots of people, large areas. It can be very dramatic. So this is what it usually comes in out our mind when we think about disasters. And these are the contexts that usually the disaster research is also focusing on. But there are also other kind of contexts, much more banal, much more less dramatic, much more bounded. For example, in one building or one room, where is an agent that can cause, for example, health threat, is in contact with the social system. And these are the contexts which allows us quite easily to very closely to analyze how the physical environment actually interact with cross processes. And in this talk, I will focus in one kind of such context, and these are indoor problems. So first, let's think what is indoor air. Indoor air is everywhere here. We cannot touch it. Usually we cannot smell it, and we really cannot see it. But this certain moment when the indoor air stops to be here, in a few seconds or minutes, we're all dead. So it's extremely, extremely important thing, but usually we do not think about. However, sometimes we might start to notice that in certain room there's constantly a bad odor, or there's stuffy air and we get headache, or if we have asthma, we might have difficulty to breathe. And then we start to notice that there might be something wrong, and this we call as an indoor problem. So indoor problem refers to a situation where people start to think that the indoor quality of the building is constantly poor. So it is already a social phenomenon. There are many things that can influence indoor quality. These are ventilation, building materials and furnishing, indoor mold, outdoor pollutants, smoking, and more we have learned that, for example, viruses. There are very, very much literature and research on the association or relation between indoor quality and health. And from that research, we have learned that indoor quality is related to, for example, to respiratory symptoms and illnesses like asthma, some other mucosal symptoms like eye irritation or skin irritation, and also those so-called non-specific symptoms like headache and fatigue. However, the picture is not so clear. The problem here is that some of these symptoms, especially those non-specific symptoms like headache or fatigue, can be caused also some other factors in the building or in the room, like workload. So it can be very difficult sometimes, or quite often, actually to very strongly prove that my symptoms are caused by the indoor quality, because it can be quite easily consisted, and that makes indoor problems so complex, and there are lots of uncertainty related to them. And that's not the only thing. Also, there's some medical or scientific uncertainty, since although we have a lot of evidence that there is a relation between indoor quality and the symptoms, there's not very clear understanding what's the mechanism underneath. In addition, what makes things even more complicated, that there's a large individual differences in how we react indoor quality. So some people might have very strong health effects in certain room, for example, where the others doesn't have any reaction, and they don't even notice that there might be something wrong. So there might be difficult to create a shared understanding what is actually going on. The reparation processes and investigation processes are also often quite slow, and it might be quite difficult to find what actually causes this problem. So all the time, the question of invisibility, the uncertainty, are very salient when we're speaking about indoor problems. And finally, in this quite complex issue, there's lots of economical interest, because to repair a building is quite costly. And finally, there are cultural differences or differences between countries. In Finland, where all this data has been collected that I will show you soon, there's quite high awareness that especially indoor mold can have is related to negative health effects. So in the study of Nisila, they show that in a school where there's no observed indoor problem, still 15% of the parents were worried that the indoor quality can be somehow harmful for the children. And in a school where there was an observed indoor problem, it was 70%. But when we look at the situation in Poland, and I'm sorry this is quite an old study, but this is what I found, is that only 1% of Polish parents were concerned about the health risk posed by indoor environment. So there's strong cultural and social component also in this way. And in Finland, this awareness of indoor problem has led also, for example, collective action, like here in this demonstration or protest in Kuopio. But there's some issues has certainly changing still during the COVID. So I think that during the COVID period, the knowledge, the understanding that indoor quality matters has increased. So this is a changing process. Okay. So this was some kind of introduction to this issue, and hope everybody are now clear what are indoor problems. So when I started to study how indoor quality is associated with group processes and well-being, especially to psychological well-being, psychosocial well-being, there were actually no studies in this topic, very, very little. And therefore, most of these studies I will present you today are very exploratory studies. Still, I have started in quite the beginning. And when you start in such a position, one quite natural way to try to understand what is this all about is ask this from people who had experienced indoor problem. And therefore, we conducted data collection with the Finnish Institute Literature Society writing event, and asked people to write about their experiences related to indoor problems. This was a nationwide collection, and in the end, 62 persons sent us their stories and essays, and some of them were very, very long. When I received this data, I was actually quite surprised. I thought that, or I expected that I would find stories and experiences related to social relationship, but I didn't wait what I found there. So even though people were talking about their symptoms, they were talking about the building where they get these symptoms, but what they were talking about the most, that was their social relationships, how there has been changed the social relationships because of the indoor problems, and how much suffering it has caused to them. So their experience and their suffering very much stemmed from the social relationships, from how the groups or the others has treated them, and so on. So indoor problems seems to be, in these essays, very much about problems and suffering in a social level. What I've been especially interesting are the workplaces and the problem from the workplaces. So when we focused at the beginning from the 23 essays, which were focusing only mostly on indoor problems in workplaces. And we conducted a thematic analysis, and based on this analysis, it was possible to find some kind of narrative, some kind of stories. What happened there in these workplaces? Where does this social suffering evoke from? What is the process? And it seems so that the first problem here, or the first issue that they raised there was the conflict of responsibility. That is, who were responsible of these people's symptoms? Those who had the symptoms perceived that it was the employer or the supervisor or the owner of the house, whereas the others and maybe the colleagues perceived that it was employees' personal business. And this conflict caused a lot of suffering. So at the first, I was a favored and valued employee, wrote one respondent. But when I was so constantly ill, the blaming began, and I became a burden to the rest of the working community. Everyone shrugged their shoulders, and no one took responsibility for the working environment, having made me sick. It was a shock to realize how alone I was with this, and that no one was interested in. So the experience to be alone, to not be receiving support, was highly shared by these respondents. The next phase of this process seems to be a moral exclusion. So what these people reported was that often their stories and their interpretation were not believed, and they were excluded from the moral sphere of the intragroup. And also, often they reported that their mental health were questioned. So one respondent with quite difficult symptoms wrote, "My knowledge and experience were constantly nullified. Mentally, I found all the opposition nearly hard. I often cried at home. I realized that my actual illness was not taken seriously, but in the workplace they tried to make me mentally ill." And these kind of experiences of delimitation, they were very common, and often people with suffering from contested illnesses in general report such experiences. And finally, there was the phase of objectification. So, in addition to feel that you were not being taken seriously or your mental health were questioned, people felt that they have lost their value as a human being. Not all, but some of them. And here an example from a nurse who has to change the ward where she worked. The senior nurse assured me that no one had symptoms in this ward and that there was no mold there. So this is a new ward where she would like to go. And when I reported in the morning, one talking nurse laughed out loud. "Oh, it's nice to have you here. Now we have a living indicator. If you become ill, we'll all know there's mold here too." So this is an expression of that, what would we call maybe dehumanization, but at least that the person being objectified. She was the indicator, something we told others whether there was mold or not, and no one really cared of her own health. Okay, so what we find here, we find a process which been actually reported by Opoto, for example, that in a context of conflicts, individuals are often at the risk of being morally excluded, especially if they're minority members, and objectified, which further legitimizes the rule violation, the justice rule violation. So, as we can see here, the individual problems really changed the dynamic of these groups, at least from the perspective of one of or some of its members. But there's also another part that we have to take into account, is that when people are in insecure position, they are also more prone to evaluate others' treatment and practices from a perspective of injustice. And it's possible that we have also this kind of process going on. Okay, so it seems that indoor problems are accompanied by the experience of injustice, at least among these respondents from a data of 23 essays, which is not much. So the next phase of this process was check or test, actually, is there some association with poor indoor quality or perceived poor indoor quality and injustice experiences? And in order to do that, we used the quality of work-like survey from 2013. And it's a large survey which is done in Finland about every 6 years, and it includes about, in 2030, about 4,500 respondents. This is a representative sample and nationwide. And this survey has two set of questions. The ones are related to workplaces, environment, including also question on mold and ventilation, and the others on discrimination and injustice. And we checked whether there is a correlation or association actually between these two things. Very simple. So this was a very simple analysis. And here we have the items. So we check with each of these items and different experiences of injustice, that we call them, whether they were associated with a predictor. And a predictor has 3 cases. Those who reported there were no harm, so they did not perceive that there was indoor mold or bad ventilation, which was harmful for them in their workplace. Then there was those who reported there were poor ventilation, but no mold or in their workplace. And then there was the rest who reported that there were mold in their workplaces that they perceived harmful, and this was 11% of the respondents. And what we did find, we find that the perception of mold in the workplace was associated, there was a significant difference with the reference group, which was no harm in each of these items. So injustice experiences were associated in each of these items with perception that there's mold in the workplace. And this is not the whole data, but it is, you can see the older results in the publication. In addition, there was also a difference in some of these cases with the ventilation and mold. Okay, so this gives us a quite strong evidence that at least in Finland, with this nationwide and representative data, there is something going on. Then we continued and checked whether we could find some similar in a school context. Whether in schools with poor indoor environment quality, there are more problems, for example, in social climate, than in schools where there is no problems with the indoor quality. And in order to test this, we use another large-scale survey, which is collected now by Finnish Institute for Health and Welfare from 2013. And this data we used about 27,000 respondents, and this data was merged with the school data of 194 schools. And this data, the school data, was collected from principals, and it had information about an inspection, a triennial inspection required by Healthcare Act in Finland that has to be done in Finnish schools every 3rd year. And it has also information whether there's been found an indoor problems or not, problems in the indoor quality or not. So it's been it's a relatively objective information. And this information we merge with the students' data, where we had information how the students perceive that their relationship with the teachers are. So the perceived teacher-student relationship. And this is a multi-level analysis. And what we did find there was that in the schools where there is an observed indoor problem, there the relationship with teachers are worse than in the schools where there are no problems with indoor quality. Again, we have the similar finding that this kind of uncertain, invisible environment problem is associated with negative group processes. And finally, in the fourth exploratory study, we used a similar kind of data, but now a few years later, 2017. Here we have 25,000 respondents from 222 schools, which has similar information now whether there is damps and mold in the school perceived in the inspection. We use the same items on teachers, student relationship, and a school spirit too. And we also has a mediator here, so that is the perception, students' perception, whether there is how they perceive the inequality of the school. And we ran an analysis, now using a multi-level mediation analysis, and we tested a model whether this observed, the association between the observed mold and dampness and teacher-student relationship or school spirit was mediated by the perceived student perceived indoor environment quality. And what did we find? We found that the association between observed mold and dampness, that our relatively objective measure, and the association with this, with the students' reported teacher-student relationship and class spirit, was fully mediated by the students' subjective indoor quality. But this is a school level, so this is the average level that the students perceive that the indoor quality to be in the school. So the observed mold and dampness reported by the principals was related to the degree students perceived that there was a poor indoor quality, and this fully explained or mediated this how they reported the teacher-student relationship. So the physical reality here affected the social reality only if the students were agreed or they were aware that there's a problem or they perceived that there was a problem. So the problem itself, actually, it was on a social level. It's on a student knowledge and perception. Okay. So now I have presented you 4 studies, and the question is: does poor indoor quality relate to group processes and uncertain, invisible environment threat? And based on these 4 data, which 3 of them are highly representative and nationwide in Finland, we can say yes, at least in this context, we can see strong evidence that there is association between such an environment threat and group processes. So the question is, why may poor indoor quality influence group processes? Why is this such a association or relation? One thing that the qualitative data tells us that different interpretations of risk and responsibilities seems to be one reason for these negative group processes, and that is the start of conflicts. But that's not very much. So in order to better understand how the environmental thread like poor indoor quality, a very banal indoor environment thread, shapes group processes. I have now done an 2-year school ethnography, spending time in a school with an indoor problem that's been also acknowledged by the authorities. And this participant observation started just a little before the COVID hit Finland. And so this is also an ethnography of COVID in a Finnish school. But that's another story. And this ethnography includes about more than 100 interviews and participant observations, and also interviews of 19 principals from other schools, so in order to get a little bit larger perspective what's going on. This process is really an ongoing process, and in the analysis, I think it's quite in the beginning. But I raise here some issues, some themes that seems to be there very prevalent. So we might explain at a school context why, for example, the teacher-student relationship is perceived worse in the schools with indoor problems than there's no indoor problems. It's the lack of resources. This is very simple explanation, but it relates to the fact that many of teachers in the schools have symptoms, and as one explains, that it takes their resources. So in me, it appeared as a certain kind of tightness and fatigue, and you did as you were used to do, or you just tried to get along. In addition to the health issues, an environmental threat, it also pushed the groups to adapt somehow to the new situation. This is in a very practical manner. And this school where I've been, one very common thing was that they kept the windows open, and they were quite cold outside, so often the students, some of them at least, used jackets. Another practical solution were the break times. So when COVID started, or before the COVID started, during the break times, the students were inside of the school. So they didn't go out during the school day. And the air quality, it was a stuffy air there. But due to COVID, the teacher and principals decided that the students had to go outside. And after the COVID situation get easier, they continued that because they noticed that actually this is helped a lot the situation in the school. And this practical solution, which was due to this environmental threat that they have to live with, actually created quite much conflicts between students and teachers because the students really didn't want to be outside. So this is one mechanism that's just very practical, how the environmental factors may affect the group processes. And this is an interview, but I don't read it now when a student is claiming or saying that it's not nice to go out. And the final thing, which relates to such an environmental threat with lots of uncertainty, is that it seems to erode the trust. So often many of these principals I interviewed, as well as the teachers I interviewed, what they tell me that they had often a problem to know whether the students really had symptoms or not. Can they really let them to go home or not? Not all teachers thought that, but some of them, and especially some principals. So it seemed so that in such context, which is not very clear what it can do, the process which comes is that it erodes trust. And here we have an extract where the one teacher explains, or actually supervisor. We have some students who have used now very clearly, well, indoor symptoms as a bit like a permit tag to be out of the school. So that, well, then it's been seen that it's a kind of like a get out of a jail free card, which can I take advantage of. So this is one from one interview. So to the question, why may poor indoor quality influence group processes? We might have at least 4 reasons which really need much better to be analyzed and studied. So one is the different interpretation of risk and responsibilities, the lack of resources, stress-inducing practical solution would create conflicts, and finally, the degrees of intergroup trust. And this is really much related to uncertainty. An uncertain environment threat seems to decrease trust. Okay. So far, what I have shown you, that it seems so that with a poor indoor quality as an example of an invisible and uncertain environment threat, this is accompanied with social stressors. They are related to each other. And the next question is, what does it mean? And what does it mean from the perspective of well-being? So in order to understand, does the combination of poor indoor quality and social stressor influence well-being, we again analyze the quality of life work survey, but now we use data from 4 years and merge with the registered data of Kela. The Kela is the Finnish social insurance institution, which has information of sickness allowances paid for medically certified absences longer than 10 days. So in Finland, if you're sick, you get paid from the employer the first 10 days, and then it goes to the Kela, and that's why we have information only from that, but this includes all the Finnish population. And from the quality of work-like survey, we used again the same questions, a little bit more of them. So this is about indoor environment quality perception, including heat, cold, and so on, but also the mold and ventilation. It was 8 items. And then unjust experiences, and they were first used as the summed variables. And from the Kela, the registered data, we get this information of these sickness days. And the data is constructed so that the time 1 is the time when the people had answered the questionnaire, and then we have the information from their sickness leaves 1 year later to 3 years later, so there's some kind of longitudinal aspect there. And we conducted a very simple analysis here. So the answers were categorized so that we had 4 groups. One group where we had people with a good indoor quality and no injustice experiences. Then we have a group with good indoor quality and injustice experiences. Then we have people with poor indoor quality and no injustice experiences. And finally, people with poor indoor quality and injustice experiences. And we tested whether there is differences in their sickness absence, the number of absence days in each of these groups. So not very complicated. And what we did find here was that if people had only one stressor here, like a good indoor quality and no experience, no stressors at all, then they differed positively from all the rest of groups. So no stressors, no good indoor quality and no injustice. If they have 2 stressors, so either poor indoor quality or injustice experiences, they differed from the first group, but not from each other. So it seems that it's the same. Do you have, which one of these stressors you have, the absence days are the same. But if you have two stressors, both injustice experiences and perceived poor indoor environment quality, then your absence rates are the longest. The absence days are the longest. So it seems that when there's a combination of both the environment stressor and the social stressor, that makes things even worse. So does a combination of poor indoor quality and social stressor influence well-being? Yes, it does, based on this data. And in Finland. Okay. So finally, it seems that in a context of poor indoor inequality, that is an example of an invisible, of uncertain environment threat, it is often related to negative group processes. And these combinations leads to even worse health outcome. But it's not only the combination of them, it's also that when the group processes are negative, this also means that the group loses resources, because in sometimes and often positive group processes are able to buffer the stress. So they not only have an additional stress, but they also lose a resource. So finally we tested whether does the positive group process actually buffer the association between poor indoor quality and well-being. And again, we have the same data as previously, but instead of injustice experiences, we use now social support from the supervisor. And here are we groups. So as you can see, there's high support and low support groups, and these good and bad or poor indoor environment quality. And here the important part is here. So these people who report that having a poor indoor quality at their workplace, but they have had support from the supervisor, their absence days are lower than those who hasn't had support from the supervisor. So we can see an effect that positive group processes buffer the stress. This is very simple analysis. In order to do something more a little bit sophisticated, we tested with the school students a little bit similar kind of hypothesis, and now we have about 71,000 respondents from 678 schools, and this is highly representative. And we conduct a random intercept and slope model using the as an anxiety and perceived indoor environment quality and the social climate. And just to explain a little bit what we did here is that what we were interested was the association between the perceived indoor quality, that's again the same, what we've been talking so much, and the anxiety, and how much there were the slope between these two variables varies between schools. So this is the random slope. And we explain this variance between slopes by social climate of the school, which included items on teacher-student relationship and school spirit, the same items I've been showing you before. And what did we find here? We found here first that perceived indoor environment quality was associated with anxiety. So worse you perceived the inequality or inequality to be in your school, the more anxious you were. Okay, that's not a surprise. So what we found here is that in those students who are in a school with a good social climate, that means that they have they perceive that the teacher-student relationship is good and a good climate, a good school spirit. These schools where students perceive so, the association between perceived inequality and anxiety was lower. Whereas if there was a weak social climate, it was stronger. So this gives us evidence that the context in a school, if it has a good social climate or bad social climate, buffered the association between poor inequality and anxiety. And this gives us a further evidence when we're asking, are positive group processes able to buffer negative association between poor inequality and well-being? That yes, at least in this data, it is possible. Okay, so now I'm ready to list some conclusions. I have shown you quite many research. So the first is that a poor perceived inequality is related to group processes. That is an example of an environmental threat which is invisible and which has lots of uncertainties in it. And it is related especially to negative group processes. Then I show that the combination of poor perceived inequality and social stressors influences well-being. So it makes even worse if there is not only the physical stressor, but also it's combined with a social stressor. And finally, I show that positive group processes can buffer negative associations between poor perceived inequality and well-being. And that leads to a very important question that I cannot answer yet. That if and how we can then maintain or promote a positive group processes when groups are facing environmental stressors which induce uncertainty. How we can stop the vicious circle with uncertainty and different kind of interpretation related to environment threat and group processes. And I don't have any clear answer yet. The ethnography and the interviews where I'm studying this issue is far away from ready, the analysis. But there's one thing I would like to raise here, and this is accepting uncertainty. So it seems in this that in this data I've been collecting, that if a person, especially the person who has the power over the other people, is able to accept that this is uncertain, I don't understand why, or I'm not sure whether or not these symptoms, what the other report, are caused by the environmental threat or not. But in the end, it doesn't matter so much. It's fine. But as a human being, my duty is to support and help this person, even though that I'm not sure why is it so. And it seems that this acceptance of uncertainty helps the group and protect the group from negative intergroup processes, which are associated to such a negative, such an environmental threat with lots of uncertainty and invisibility. So finally, in the very beginning of this talk, I say that what I hope that you remember from this talk is that when we analyze group processes, we should take into account also the environment where the group is, where it acted, where it worked, where it studied. And that the group processes and the environment, they interact. And usually, when groups act, usually the environment where the group is fine. It's nice. We don't actually very much pay attention to the environment. But in the moment where the environment starts to be threatful, or somehow where we associate a threat to the environment, like in disasters, we can see that it really starts to shape the group processes. And even such a banal thing as in the problem in the end, comparing it to these big disasters, this kind of environment threat can strongly shape group processes. And this is, I hope, that you remember. Thank you.